Good morning. Thank you, Steve, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to join you here. More importantly, thank you to each one of you for doing the work that you do. In the last year or so since we started working with firefighters, I've become ever more aware that I live the life I live because you do the work you do. In 2015, firefighting was identified as the most stressful job in the United States. Second to that was men serving in the military. Something you and I have in common, that we have in common with every human being, is that we have a basic need to be seen, to be heard, and to be understood. What you and I share professionally is that our professions are based on a philosophy of stoicism. If you have an emotion that's interfering with your ability to function in the workplace, get rid of the emotion or don't come to work. And the other part of our work that is common is that there's a stigma. We don't ask for help. We tough it out. We can do it on our own. And what do I know, both with regard to the military, with regard to firefighting, and with regard to medicine, is that stoicism kills. And what's really important is another feature that we have in common, and that through all of this, that something that can prevent some of the hardships has to do with high-quality connections. And that's the basis of the work that we seek to do in developing the Loon Lake program. I'm just going to give the introduction, and Duncan's going to tell you about the program in its detail and some of the results that we've had. And you know, we've run several groups with firefighters, and whenever we finish, I wish I could breach confidentiality, because the work we do is always cloaked under a doctor-patient relationship with the groups. And I wish I could breach confidentiality so I could tell my friends, my neighbors, the public, newspapers about the work that you do and the price that you pay to do it. The work that we do began in 1997 when a courageous soldier asked us for help. That program took 10 years, and it became a 10-day residential program. We moved from the military to work with RCMP officers, corrections officers, and now we're doing similar work with men with prostate cancer. And working with all of those disciplines, what we began to appreciate is that people were having a normal response to an unusual event. And that in medicine, we like to pathologize things and identify them and label them, so we call that PTSD. We stopped using those terms. With the military, it was a 4-letter word. And we began to appreciate that what we need to do is to understand that this is a normal response to an unusual event. The work that Duncan and I started in 2015, because again, a courageous firefighter asked us for help. What do I know? What do I know about your work? I know that death is part of your work. And apart from death, so are motor vehicle accidents, child abuse, domestic violence, suicide, murder, and other tragedies. I also know that if ever you experience a sense of helplessness in the face of unfixable suffering, which I'd be so bold as to say that everyone in this room has experienced, it's true of medicine, a sense of helplessness in the face of unfixable suffering puts you at risk of being psychologically traumatized. And apart from what you see, there are other stressors: overtime, the unpredictable nature of your work, long hours, departmental politics, interrupted sleep, putting out at a high level all the time, lack of regular meals, reporting tragic news to families, and moving from one traumatic event to another. And what are the consequences? This is serious. What are the consequences? Absenteeism, burnout, depression, sleep disturbances, anxiety, alcoholism, substance abuse, PTSD, and suicide. We hear about those, each of those, in the groups that we work with. And embedded in each of those components, there is a sense of isolation, shame, fear, grief, and anger. And when you retire, you're not free of it. There's emerging evidence that people who retire from firefighting in their first years after retirement are at a higher risk for suicide because of a loss of identity, a loss of purpose, and a loss of social support. Let's look at suicide more seriously. One of the recent theories of suicide has to do with 3 components. And it's important to be aware of these for yourself as well as for the people that you work with. What are they? The first one is a thwarted sense of belonging. I no longer feel like I belong. I feel like I am alone. A second one has to do with a sense of being a burden. I am a burden to the people around me. The people I love and the people I work with would be better off without me in their lives. And the third one has to do with a comfort of lethality. And that's again where medicine and the lives of first responders are similar. Because of the people we provide care for, we're more exposed to death and dying than most people are in society. And that's one of the features that then puts us at risk. And medicine and first responders all have a higher rate of suicide than the general public. And we can do something about it. It's called resilience. It's the focus of our work. And we know that the 4 pillars of resilience have to do with sleep, exercise, diet, and social support. Deppe and Salzberg have written a book, 2016, on resilience, and they talk about 3 components of the social support. The first one has to do with realistic, optimistic thinking. What's that about? That's about believing that I can have a positive effect in the workplace. It's the belief that my efforts are helpful to others, and it's also a sense that I can ask for help, that I can believe that problems can be solved. The second one has to do with social support, knowing that support is available. And this is one of the strongest features. There's 2 components to this. And this is true in healthcare as well as in the lives and the work environment of first responders. The most important ingredients to feel social support have to do with safety, inclusion, and trust. Gordon, in his introduction, talked about the inner journey. What's happening on the inside of me when I'm at the workplace? And what's important about safety, inclusion, and trust? Can I tell you about what's going on inside of myself without the fear of being ridiculed, dismissed, or diminished? If I can't do those things, my workplace isn't safe. And the other important feature of this has to do with leaders. Leaders are essential. They're crucial to a sense of a safe work environment. That has to do with captains and chiefs in the firefighting world. And the third component of this has to do with self-efficacy for coping. I believe that I can do what I need to do to take care of myself if ever I'm in a stressful situation. And each of these 3 components are interrelated. And each of them are most effective at 3 levels. First of all, the individual, me. Can I assume responsibility for who I am and for the impact my work has on me? The second one has to do with relationships. That's you and me. Do I have a relationship in the workplace where I can be completely honest with somebody about the effect, the changes that I'm feeling? And our work changes us. My work changed me. Our work changes us. And do I have somebody I can talk to? Do I have somebody that can actually say to me, you know, David, you're not the guy you used to be. Something's changed inside yourself. Something's changed in the way you relate to me. So 1 is what's happening inside myself. 2 is our relationship. And 3 is at an organizational level. And this is where I'm amazed and marvel at the work of Steve and the Mental Health Steering Committee. What they're doing is, I've said this to them, and it's an inappropriate description, but they're like a house on fire. They just keep going because they're determined to make a difference for the benefit of the members of firefighting. I know that your training on the physical aspects of firefighting are such that the more you practice, the more you'll be prepared for whatever confronts you. It's called a muscle memory. What Duncan and I are trying to do is work on a mental muscle memory so that the people who go through the program will also be prepared for whatever confronts them emotionally and psychologically. We cannot predict who will have a house fire. We can predict that all people will benefit from learning about fire prevention. We cannot predict who will suffer the consequences in their minds and their hearts in terms of the work they do. We cannot predict who will suffer the consequences. We can predict that firefighters will benefit from training in resilience. And that's what our goals are, to prevent the consequences, to contribute to a sense of strength of resilience, to provide training for participants, to develop a common language. And we always talk about never about us without us. The program we're running is iterative. If people make recommendations to what we need to improve, what we need to change, we work on it. We hope that people will have a common frame of reference in terms of their coping strategies, and we hope also that people will reinforce skills one for another. Gandhi said, "You may never know what results come from your action, but if you do nothing, there will be no result." Thank you.
Well, that's the end of that.
Yeah.
Those of you who have worked with a really cohesive or a tight team know that when you're working with colleagues, with peers who have your back, you can do extraordinary things. Now, that's whether it's a team, in athletics, playing a sport, or whether you're going into very difficult work, challenging work. I'm privileged to work with David. He's part of my team, a cohesive team. And despite the fact that some of this work over the years has been difficult and challenging, I always know that somebody's got my back. And that supports my resilience. Resilience is something that we often have thought about as being a quality of the individual. It's like strength, muscle strength. Some people have it, some people don't. But what we've learned over the years about resilience, about coping, about being able to be really strong and endure under adverse circumstances, is that resilience is very dynamic. It's something that emerges, and it actually emerges in the context of relationship. That when we have a very cohesive team, we're more resilient. We can cope with more. If you think about even performance, top athletes, top athletic performance emerges very often in the context of relationships, sometimes even with an individual athlete, the context of a relationship with a fantastic coach. That when we're backed, when we have a relationship with somebody that can help us dig deep and find strength in ourselves that we may not have known was there. As we talk about resilience, I'm going to start with this metaphor of a bubble. Because even a year and a half ago when I started to work more seriously, I've been in private practice doing trauma work for 23 years. I got close to 19,000 hours in session. My wife tells me I still need some more, but I've been working with firefighters and police and first responders of a variety of uniform colors and military. But it wasn't until January last year that, with the help of the BCPFFA, I started interviewing with my colleague Diana Vissers, sitting down and interviewing firefighters, whether from 2 years on the job to 31 years on the job. And we accumulated 90 hours of interview to find out, why did you become a firefighter? What were your first experiences as a probationer like? When did you know that you'd arrived? And how did you learn? What were your first calls? And how did you learn to cope with difficult calls? Who modeled that for you? Who were your mentors? And I have to say, I was kind of humbled by it, and I was surprised that after 20 years, or 22 years at the time, of working with first responders, that I knew absolutely nothing. I was totally unaware, as an experienced clinician, about how little I knew about the day-to-day life, the work that you do. And what emerges is this idea that civilian society really exists within this bubble. And another way of thinking about it, or depicting it, is that under this bubble, outside of it, is a lot of the chaos and danger, unpredictability, knowledge about the fragility of human life. And civilian society lives in a kind of lovely naivety about the reality of what can happen. And on the surface of that bubble, this is my artistic side coming through, there are people with a variety of uniforms who protect most of civilian society. And it gives rise to things like the firefighter saying, "Your worst day is our every day." And so this is what society has asked you to do, and what you have stepped up to do. we, in some ways, in civilian society, have outsourced our trauma. We've specialized so that most of us don't have the experience. When I ask a civilian audience, how many of you have ever performed CPR? We get one or two hands. How many in this room have performed CPR? This is not a normal response. So what happens, one of the consequences when you move in your training and probationary years, you move from the bubble of naivety of civilian society and you move out to the surface where you're exposed to something that's quite different than the norm for civilian life. And after you've been there long enough, eventually you develop a new normal. You accumulate an extra dosage of traumatic exposure that the rest of us don't see. And that makes you different. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the consequence of specializing individuals to face trauma? What happens when we take one segment of society, you, and we give you an extra dosage of traumatic exposure? And one of the things that happens is that when you try and reemerge or come back in, when you go home from your workplace, you're different. And so the people who may have been your supports, you may feel a little bit more alienated from. The high school buddies who pursued different careers suddenly have much less in common. And they may want you to tell them stories about what you see out there, but you may resist because you don't really, you want to protect them from that. And if you do indulge in the storytelling, pretty soon you notice they've got a little green around the gills. They're not quite used to what you've seen. But it also, for military veterans coming home from a deployment, they have this saying, first world problems. You come home from Afghanistan or Bosnia or some other place, a hot spot, and you go into Starbucks and somebody's whining about the temperature of their coffee, and they give you kind of knowing look to each other and they go, yeah, first world problems. You should be so lucky. It makes them different. So for you coming home, going home, listening to your partner talk about the office politics, how do you relate when your perspective has changed? What you have a sense of what matters has changed. And so this makes a difference. It makes you different than the people around you. It can be alienating, but it also gives you this double dosage. And that's what I'd like to talk about initially. The resiliency program is one tool in a toolbox to start to address some of the consequences of being on the surface of the bubble, if you will. Because there's a problem that happens, a combination of a high cultural expectation of mastery and control. Because if you're going to go out there and do that work, well, we select for people who we think are courageous and have the strength to endure that. There's going to be a high exposure to trauma that comes by definition with the work. There's low trauma resiliency preparation. The BCPFFA did a survey of its members in 2015, found that 66% had faced some kind of critical incident stress or experienced critical incident stress over the last year. That 76% of BC firefighters had received no training whatsoever in terms of trauma resiliency. So there's an inevitability of exposure, but a lack of preparation. Low treatment uptake or effectiveness. It's notorious that first responders and military they either come to therapy and then check out again, they drop out early, and that's really not your fault, that's people like me. We've done a really, really poor job of making our services actually relevant, palatable, and deployable in real time, making them really relevant. And experiences foster isolation and distance. They alienate you from the people that you love. All of that can leave you with really being under-resourced, increased stigma, and interfere with social supports during times of significant challenge and ongoing operational stress. So we have really here a known hazard. And if you think about the principles of disaster preparedness, these are ideas that you're familiar with. What is disaster preparedness? We take a known hazard, and by the proper application of knowledge and resources, skills, we keep that known hazard from becoming a disaster. And so how are we doing that with your work? Because when we talk about the big one hitting BC, we know that hope is actually not a strategy. I hope it isn't going to happen. We know that military veterans, people go to service, they go into a firefight, a different kind of firefight. And everybody goes in thinking it won't happen to me. Maybe somebody else, but not me. But that hope is not an effective strategy. And so I'd like to take you really on a bit of a road trip to think through some of the consequences of your work, some of the inevitabilities, and to start to really not simplify it, but actually complicate your thinking. I want to make it more nuanced, because the more you see the complexity of it, the more nuanced your response to it. So I'm going to start really talking about traumatic stress and adaptation, because it really is, as human beings, why do we have a stress response? Why do we respond? Why do we have these inconvenient body responses and emotions? Why, as I sat there ready to come up on stage, were my hands shaking? Why do we have, that's inconvenient. I've given lots of talks. Why does my body not learn that I'm okay? I'm going to talk a little bit about Stoic service culture, because how we prepare individuals to do difficult service is part of the context in which you experience any kind of reaction to traumatic stress. And then I'll talk about the resiliency program specifically as one tool. Just one tool, it's one way of starting to address that. So to start this, I really start taking a journey. This is a picture that was snapped by Dan Jansen, a biologist at the University of Pennsylvania, in the jungle in Nicaragua. And why are we talking about this? It looks like a snake, doesn't it? But if we're going to start to think about, why do we have stress responses? Why do our bodies respond to threat, to any kind of threat to our survival that we see, that we imagine? What is the whole function of that? This is actually a good place to start, because every species that is on the planet has developed some kind of strategy to survive, to eat, and preferably not be eaten. And this looks like a snake, but it's a caterpillar, it's a hemorrhoplanes species. And this little caterpillar he's a little guy with a plan. He's got a survival plan. And its survival plan is that over hundreds of thousands of years, through genetic mutation, from generation to generation to generation, it's developed a survival strategy that when it's under threat, it can puff up its rear end. This is the rear end of a caterpillar, and make it look like the predator of its own predator. So the bird that preys on it is afraid of this particular kind of venomous snake, and so the caterpillar has morphed its body to respond to that, to stay alive. And so not only can it puff it up, but it actually rears up. It's even the behavior, it rears up and makes striking motions at the bird in order to stay alive. And if you think about the complexity of that as a survival strategy, that even somewhere in evolution, these are not reflections, these white marks, they're actually white marks that mimic reflection in the eyes of the real snake. And so we've got this incredible complexity of a response that it's sort of startling as we look at it. As human beings, what is our response? What is our strategy? And as much as this, you can see the complexity of it in the morphology, this is, in fact, far simpler than the human response. It's far less elegant, because this response is incredibly brittle. It's very, very narrow. If anything happens within the ecosystem that changes the predator, changes the threat type, then in one generation, an invasive species that comes in and is a new predator that isn't responding to this strategy, then within one generation, this could lose all of its survival effectiveness. Just like that, one generation. And it would take hundreds of thousands of years of genetic mutation in order to develop a new strategy. So it creates an incredible vulnerability. As human beings, we have something that is much more complex. Rather than puffing out our rear end, we've puffed out our brain. And we have developed an incredible learning survival mechanism, a learning brain that adapts to any number of threats, ever-changing threats, so that we respond as a survival strategy to every main predator in every ecosystem across the world, and we even respond to the master predator, which is other human beings. We have a learning brain that can learn and adjust our response to any threat. This is an important concept because if you think about it, what is that? Hundreds of thousands of years of evolution that resides in you and it resides in me that we carry into our work and that you carry into the next motor vehicle accident that you respond to. And so looking at what is your evolutionary inheritance and how can you understand that and start to understand what your inevitable and evolutionary adaptive responses might be and how they might actually interfere with performance. And so at a basic level, traumatic stress is about a response and a stand down, a gas pedal and a brake pedal that allows us to respond, energize the body, respond to whatever the threat is, and then come back down again. So that even as a very puny species that we are with blunt claws and blunt teeth and soft skin, when we are confronted with stress, we have a low, very primitive response system. It's fast. It's a low part of the brain, sometimes called the reptilian brain. People have heard of that. That responds within about 50 milliseconds. And so if you look at the brain, I think there's the response, information comes into an area called the thalamus, which is kind of like an air traffic control. It controls all information coming in. But then it passes through, there it is, this part right here, called the amygdala, which is a fire tower. And the function of the amygdala is just to survey information coming in for threat. And as soon as it discovers that there's threat, it sends messages down to the pituitary gland to release chemical messages down to the adrenal glands above your kidneys to release cortisol, to the blue spot, locus coeruleus. It's just Latin for blue spot. I like to complicate things. But to release adrenaline, so that within about 50 milliseconds, your body responds to stress. And so you get the typical kind of stress response. Your blood flow is shunted from the periphery to the big muscles in your hearts and your lungs, your legs, right? So if you're cut, you'll bleed less because it's shunted away from the periphery. Your mouth may go dry. Your gastrointestinal system shuts down because that's not needed for immediate survival. So under high stress, you may experience butterflies. Under really high stress, scared, shitless, right? Veterans talk about the experience of basically ejecting lunch both ends under high stress. You shut down your immune system. Physicians, 2 weeks after their comprehensive exams, experience a high level of cardiovascular illness. So all of these things happen blistering fast. If somebody jumps out of a locker at you, you'll have that immediate response. And that's long before, that body response is long before information crawls from this lower regions of the brain up until this kind of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the orbital medial prefrontal cortex. You won't be tested on that. But there are these complex areas of the brain that are involved in meaning making. So as human beings, we have this capacity to make meaning of our experiences. Information doesn't get up here until about 450 milliseconds. So first your body responds, and then you get this sober second look at the information that then allows you to go, oh, okay, false alarm, put the brake on. Or, yes, it's a real threat. How do I have a nuanced response? Down at this low, fast response area, you've got 3 responses: fight, flight, and the one we don't talk about very much, freeze. And both are very adaptive as initial. When you face this guy, freeze is the appropriate response because you escape detection, hopefully. Then you might go into flight, and then you might go into fight. But all of that are these blistering fast responses. Later, you get the more complex, so that the secondary appraisal, you might go, oh, it's not a bear. It's actually just a log, and your body stands down. But that's happening all the time, throughout every day. It happens when you cross the street, when you're driving your car. It's not just the big threats. It's any small threat to our survival has this gas pedal, brake pedal effect on your body. Responding, stand down, respond, stand down, respond, stand down. And it'll do that normally over the course of an entire lifetime without much problem. But remember, if we think about humans as this adaptive learning system, what is it about us that can learn, and where does that come in? Because normally, while this will respond and stand down, there are times when the brain learns and says, I get it. Life is a dangerous, chaotic, and unpredictable place. So I'm going to switch off. Rather than standing down, I'm going to adapt as if it's always chaotic, unsafe, and unpredictable. Always. And you think about the survival value of this, that if this part of the brain decides that life is unpredictable and unsafe, it's going to keep you in a hypervigilant survival mode. And that's probably going to save your life. From an adaptive evolutionary point of view, this is very, very important. Now, for most of us, this will switch back. That all you need to do is get yourself into a position of security and safety, and the brain will recalibrate. And you'll be able to come down again. So we call that sometimes an acute stress response, where you get vigilance, you get an exaggerated startle response, and then it kind of works its way out of your system. It's like you digest it. The trauma goes in, it's there for a bit, and then you work through it, and the brain readjusts. But there are a couple of situations where instead of readjusting, the brain will grab a hold of it and not readjust. So early childhood trauma followed by a later life trauma, this is a pretty good prediction that there will be this kind of response. One massive index event, one big trauma can do it, can switch you over into this hypervigilant mode. Or what we're learning, and this is really the last 5 to 10 years, there's another scenario, and that is accumulation of enough trauma. Enough rocks in the backpack over a lifetime, and the brain goes, I get it. At any point, it can adjust and not come down. So when you're 2 years in, as a firefighter, the tones go, you go to the call, you come back, and you go back to sleep. And by 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, the tones go, you come back to the hall, and you're not going to sleep for the rest of the night. You can't shut down again. It's not happening naturally. And so, whereas naturally this kind of countervailing experiences of safety and security will reset the brain, there are conditions under which that safety and security won't happen. We can also jam that up by just avoiding. We can avoid any of those circumstances, and then we don't get the lesson that we're okay. Or we can numb out with alcohol or drugs, and then we don't get the opportunity to recalibrate. So if this doesn't happen naturally, evidence-based therapies are all about this last one. It's all about strategically engineering the environment where the brain can recalibrate. That's what it's all about. There has to be safety and security, otherwise the brain will just stay in this vigilant mode. And we call that PTSD. And the thing about PTSD is that it is adaptive and inevitable under certain circumstances. And adaptive because PTSD actually serves very well on the battlefield. It's when you come home that it becomes really difficult. Intrusion, reliving memory and sensations, keeping it current, keeping it top of mind. Arousal, this kind of irritability, this kind of hypervigilance that is there. Avoidance is the other strategy. You know, prehistoric man would go back into the cave, make our world really, really small, keeps us safe. But it doesn't allow us to learn that we are safe when we go out of the cave, that was an anomaly. negative cognitions and mood, and we'll talk more about that. What's our time here? So, if this is part of your evolutionary inheritance, what does this mean when we look at specializing a group of individuals to respond to a high dosage of trauma? What does that mean? What does that set you up for? And what do you need to be aware of in order to take care of yourself and take care of each other, to have each other's backs in a different way? And what we have done traditionally, because it works in a way, is that we have trained those who serve in a kind of traditional masculine model. And when I talk about gender role, I'm not talking about biological sex. I'm talking about a series of roles that we can, for both men and women, that we can pick up. And so this kind of traditional gender role, it prepares recruits for service. So what do I mean by this? Well, these are the kinds of attributes that are associated with a traditional masculine role, but also that you see in what are called stoic service cultures of military, police, and firefighting. So toughness, intensity, strength, competition, discipline, courage, sacrifice, aggressiveness. There's also loyalty. And what you note about these is these are, why would we endorse these? Why would we teach these and perpetuate these? And it's quite simply that they work. They're effective. When the tones go, when it's time for action, this is actually, it serves very, very well. I tell a story, just in case we think this is just about men being men and endorsing these for men, I throw this picture in. And this is me at age 17. And this is largely ceremonial roles. I'm silent sentry in front of the Governor General's residence. And I'm trying to be all of that at 17, youngest man in the regiment. And silent sentry, you can't see the eyes and your very rigid movements. It's aggressive, it's driven, and you're non-responsive. Trying to be this kind of image of this kind of stoic male. And I say that, I put this up, because this is just in case we think this is just about men for men, this is the only time in my life, and I have no idea why this is. It's the only time in my life when a woman has tucked her phone number into my belt. So, the only time. I told my wife that I was going to say this. She said, well, Duncan, actually, isn't that obvious? I like you better when you shut up, too. She was very supportive. But there is this kind of stoic ideal. And if you think about probationers and how you train probationers and how you ride probationers, you think about basic training in the military, inculcating this kind of stoic ideal, making sure that people are going to be strong enough to have your back, that you're going to be able to rely on them. And you police it in each other, and you also police it in yourselves. And for women who serve in different roles, they have to do it even more to make sure that they fulfill this role. But what we don't talk about as much is that there's also this other side, this other identity that you can slip into, the abject or broken. And if you fall from grace, you can end up with a sense of shame, isolation, that this is very silencing. And the thing about this that's interesting is that it doesn't matter how long you've been good at the game. It doesn't matter how many calls you have been effective on. The next one, where you experience some kind of lingering impact, may be the one where you start to look in and you wonder, am I broken? Am I strong enough? Am I weak? And you start to silence yourself just in case somebody else will notice. And so the silencing tends to isolate, but it also perpetuates the myth that nobody's affected. So when you think about this, it's a culture that works. It's very effective. We're not going to get rid of it. we shouldn't get rid of it. But we may need to understand it, because as much as it may be really effective for go time, it may have parts of it which limit the capacity for recovery. And if you are going to accumulate an extra dosage of traumatic exposure over a lifetime, then you probably need to know how to create the conditions for recovery for yourself, rather than feeling shamed, isolated, and broken. So when you compare the Stoic ideal to an operational stress injury like post-traumatic stress disorder, we got one that dictates that you must have mastery over the environment, whereas the experience of PTSD is in itself an experience of helplessness. I couldn't change that. One gives you mastery over the thoughts. PTSD brings intrusive thoughts as your brain tries to keep that memory front and center so that you can guard against it. Mastery over the emotions versus the emotional hijacking of operational stress injuries. Mastery over the body versus the hyperarousal of PTSD. So one, the Stoic ideal, and one, this kind of fall, and a fall from grace. And so no matter how much people like me call it a disorder, we use medical language to talk about it, within the experience of the culture, Stoic service cultures like firefighting, the experience is almost synonymous with this kind of fall from grace. So I may call it a disorder, but you might call it broken. So what do I do when even showing up at my office for you might be proof positive that you're broken? Now the fact that you're in my therapy room is the first barrier that we have to overcome in order to get you recalibrated. What do we do with that? And that's a problem that mental health professionals have not done a very good job in working out. It shows up as a military participant in a program. There had always been stigma around this throughout my life and career. It was hard for me to reconcile that who I thought was a strong man had these problems and needed the help of someone else. Hard to reconcile. I'm either strong or I'm struggling, but I can't be both. It's this binary. At my work, psychologist is a dirty word. Nobody wants to see the psychologist. Like, if you have to see the psychologist, then you're weak, broken. And I could go on and on and on. There are so many of these examples in the stories of people who serve. So there's the problem. Again, circling back to the beginning. High cultural expectations of mastery and control, high exposure to trauma, low trauma resilience preparation, low treatment uptake or effectiveness, I wonder why. Experiences that may foster isolation and distance. So you're under-resourced, it increases stigma and interferes with social supports during times of significant challenge due to operational stress, and operational stress which will be ongoing, the inevitability. So one thing this is one tool, one approach, and there are many, and all of the other approaches that you'll hear about the next couple of days or have heard about, all of your peer support, all of your critical incident debriefing or defusings, all of those important conversations where you just check in with each other at the tailgate, those are all a big part of ensuring that both you are okay over the long term of your career, but also that you're able to take care of your peers. This is one thing that we know, and it's built on this concept. Sorry, I'm echoing here. Hurricane Katrina taught us some really interesting lessons. And one of those was that you could have communities that were totally devastated and were cut off and didn't get resources. And communities that were devastated but got resources. But when you looked at the long-term impact in terms of adjustment and mental health outcomes, there were these communities that were isolated and under-resourced with the kind of tangible aid being flown in, who had better outcomes, mental health outcomes. They adjusted better. And so researchers started to look at, well, why is this happening? And what they discovered was something really kind of soft. It's difficult to measure, but they developed measures for it. And they called it community efficacy. And they measure it by things like, are you able to go to your next door neighbor to borrow an egg? In other words, do you have trusting relationships within your community that you can turn to in times of need, whether they're great or they're small? And communities that had higher community efficacy, this sense of relationship, fared better independent of the resources, the money that was pumped into them. And that's really important for you because you've got two postal codes. You've got the one you go home to at night, but your fire hall is also another community. And independent of the amount of money, more money is always wonderful, but independent of the money that gets pumped in, the quality of your relationships, the cohesiveness of your teams will be an important factor in determining your long-term outcomes, not just for yourself, but also your peers that you work with. And so this program is really built on bringing firefighters together with firefighters. As much as I know about trauma and the brain, I will never understand your experiences as another firefighter will. I will never be able to validate your experience or understand it from that perspective. The firefighters who came in labeled this, they said the motto needs to be 2 in, 2 out, because we must never be alone in this ever again. We need to have each other's backs, not only with the stories that we're proud to tell, but also the stories that we wish we could forget, but can't. And so we developed a program, and we asked people because they say, well, we don't want you to come and see the Dave and Duncan show. We don't want you to come and say, what can you give us? We want you to come and be absolutely critical. We want you to come and tear us apart. We want you to be brutally honest. And that's something I found about firefighters is that you tend to be brutally honest, which makes it really easy to work with, actually, because you can tell us when we're off the mark. And so we asked participants to come and help us design a program for you, to co-design it, to create it together so that it's your program. And so they labeled it 2 in, 2 out. We wanted to measure and say, well, what difference are we making? Are we making any difference? And even more important, by gathering people together to talk about it, are we doing harm? Because then we'll stop. And so we asked participants to fill out questionnaires, mental health questionnaires, before, 2 weeks after. You don't do it right after the group because there's a bit of a honeymoon period and you'll get a false high. So you give a little bit of time, 2 weeks. Let people settle a bit. And then again at 6 months. Can we get any kind of impact that's durable? So we got this program with the objectives of understanding operational stress, just a little bit of what I presented today. Opportunity to discuss experiences, but not over a beer. Instead, in a facilitated environment, and everybody that's in the room not only understands, but have made a commitment, even if they don't want to tell their own story, that's fine. But they need to come in and be willing to back their other firefighters in the work that they want to do. Tools to maintain and regain resilience, repair and improve relationships, because let's face it, ground zero for operational stress injuries is right at home. They're the people who are most impacted. They see it first. Provide a good first mental health contact, hopefully. So a 3.5-day residential retreat, because you need to take a little bit of time away from your life. You can do psychoeducation in a half hour or an hour. But in order to really give people the experience of something different, then you need to take some time away from your life and to be immersed in it a little bit, to try things on, try tools on, and be able to understand, get out that what David was talking about, that kind of brain muscle memory. 2 professional facilitators, that's been David and myself so far, and 1 to 2 peer team leads. These are graduates. They're firefighters who have been through the program and who are coming back to help out in running it, because this is your program. There's a trajectory to the work. We come in, we create a safe zone, a cohesive team. Now the funny thing about this is like dead simple. It's so easy. We can do this within about 4 hours. You could never dream of getting a cohesive team of civilians in 4 hours. It just doesn't happen. But you bring firefighters together, and you already have something to build on, and it's part of this loyalty, this kind of loyalty to each other. So there's already within the culture something that works, because you might come not even caring whether you get result, but you'll be there if you can help out a mate. So we can build this safe zone very quickly. And then we get to the hard work. And here again, the culture of firefighting is actually not a detriment, because what do you need? Courage, lots of it. Hard work, and again, also loyalty. The courage to do the work that needs to do, the heavy lifting, I call it. I remember in the military program, one guy said, any bozo can go and get drunk. This is hard work. This is the hard work. Why do we unpack? We unpack with a strategy. You unpack experiences in order to repack them and carry them in a different way. So we drop baggage. Somebody have an opportunity to talk about a difficult experience. There are so many. Where do you choose? But you choose the one that's foremost, the one that happens to be present in mind. And it doesn't matter, because there'll be 9 other stories that circulate around the room, and you've probably lived all of those too. But you get an opportunity to talk about those experiences in a way, well, what firefighters say, the participants in the program say, I've never told anybody that. I've never talked about it in this way. We re-equip. What do we need to understand? What tools do we need to pick up? What tools do you need to put in your toolbox in order to carry on and do this work, to go back to work and continue going out on the next call, and the next call, and the next call? And then moving out strategic goal setting. Because in 3.5 days, we can do all sorts of wonderful things. But if it doesn't transfer out of that time back into your life in a way that's deployable in real time on the call or in your life or in your relationship, then we're wasting our time. We've just taken 3.5 days out of your life. It's got to transfer back. And so we spend some time also focusing on that. And what are the effects? This is a PTSD checklist, PCL5. It's a pretty standard screening measure for PTSD. And you see the participants, the first 42 coming in, came in an average of 31.7. So that's the average. They're distributed on both sides of that. About 47% of participants coming in screened positive for PTSD. And this is an upstream program. 2 weeks later, it drops to 20. From 47% screening positive to 25% screening positive in 2 weeks. In 42, the probability we test in this, is this reliable? And to say we test probability, so it's statistically significant. The chances that this happened by chance alone are less than 1 in 1,000. It's actually less than about 1 in 10,000. Cohen's D is a measure of effect size. It's a standard deviation. And so it says, well, almost 1 standard deviation. That's how distributed are you around the mean. It's a big shift. I've separated this out because we've done 5 groups so far, and we only have data coming in on the second group. So there's only an accumulation of 12. So these numbers are not specifically, these 12 are part of this group, but there's people missing. There's 30 people missing out of this. So this is our first indication of the durability of results. And what we see that over 6 months, we're continuing to see this kind of well below a clinical cut point in terms of symptoms for PTSD. It's 3.5 days. It's 3.5 days. For Beck depression inventory, cut point is about 17. Again, we see statistically significant, clinically significant, and very large effect size. To get statistical significance with 42 people, you need to have large effect size. You guys are getting it. And you're sustaining it at 6 months. It's 3.5 days. And the reason I say it's 3.5 days, I'm not bragging about the results, because I don't feel like they're my results. This is not the results that David and I are getting. This is the result that a group of firefighters came together with a lot of anxiety driving up a 7-kilometer dirt road, second-guessing all of the way, and sat down with a group of strangers, usually, firefighters they didn't know from across the province and actually across Canada now, and they did some hard work, and these are their results. These are the results not of David and my work, but their work. They worked for it. Outcome questionnaire. Again, it's called the OQ45. It's a standard measure in therapy of just if your program is effective. It measures things like symptom distress, your social role. How comfortable are you in your social role? And interpersonal relationships. How are things going at home and at work? Again, from clinical levels down to below. Statistically, clinically significant, and a large effect size, again, and sustained. So 3.5 days. Part of the reason I'm harping on the 3.5 days. What's important about this is how possible it is, how accessible it is. This actually pisses me off. Because why are firefighters suffering and under-resourced when this is so accessible? And it doesn't have to be just this program. If we can do it here, you can do it anywhere. It's accessible, it's right there. I'm going to leave you with some of the direct feedback from firefighters. And these were collected by the BC Professional Firefighters Association directly. They didn't come through David and I. But sometimes the numbers will capture part of the story, but it strips people of their words, their meaning making. And I think when you see what firefighters are actually saying about the program, their program, you'll start to understand. And I'll let you read them. So what we learned from our shared knowledge, from what we brought to the table in terms of our knowledge, and what you brought to the table in terms of your hard work and your understanding, your expertise about the work that you do and the challenges that you face. We know that traumatic response is both an evolutionary advantage and an inevitability, and also pretty inconvenient at times. And that there's great strength present even in the deepest struggle. It's where character is formed. And resiliency emerges in the context of relationships, resources, and respect. That hope doesn't work as a strategy. Hoping it doesn't affect you is not a strategy. But we have the knowledge, and you have the skills and the hard work ethic that you can do something to take care of yourselves and each other differently. And that's what we're hoping that this program really starts to open the door on, is to introduce a question mark about how you are and how you take care of each other and what you do when you experience or notice either some response within yourself or within each other. Thank you.